Hi, Jay Baba. My name is Angela Lee Chen. So my Baba story is fairly straightforward, but when I look at it in the past tense is when things really strike me as, wow, Baba works in such mysterious ways, and he finds you. I mean, it's phenomenal. So in the forward direction, I was, I'll tell you the whole story at some point, but anyway, I was in college, and there's a Tai Chi teacher that I was kind of hanging out with, and he had all this information and knowledge, and he was a Baba lover. So he would mention, if I had questions, he would use a Baba quote or whatever to answer a lot of times, and it just started feeling like, wow, every time Baba said something, I'd think about it a lot, and it would just make a lot of sense, and it just answered a lot of questions. It felt like just like being in a spiritual desert and not even knowing it, and finally getting water, and suddenly it's like, water? I never knew that existed, I grew up in a Chinese household. My dad was, I like to say anti-religious, because I don't think that he was literally anti-God per se. I think he believed in the goodness of humans, and in that sense, then he's not really anti-God. I mean, if you define God in the loosest sense, yeah, it's the goodness in humans. So in that sense, I don't think that he was really agnostic or atheistic, but he certainly didn't encourage any sort of spiritual quest. He had answered certain questions for himself, and that was our household. It was just not discussed, and nothing needed to be talked about. So my dad was Chinese, both my parents were Chinese, and my mom really, she had a lot of loss in her life. I feel like she really was very hands-off. She was very distant or removed, and she was an artist, so she just entertained herself with being an artist, and she would spend hours just in her studio. So really, she wasn't that much of a mom to me per se. And my dad was sort of like, he kind of really only paid attention to me if I was in trouble, so it's sort of like that. So he dragged the whole family down to Nairobi, Kenya. I grew up there. I was there from the age of 3 to 18 when I left for college. And so yeah, going back forward in the forward direction. So I'm hearing about Baba. Every once in a while, questions would be answered by Baba, as an appropriate quote. One of the early quotes that was read to me was, of course, the lover and the beloved. I mean, what a wonderful piece. God is love, and love must love. And to love, there must be a beloved. But since God is existence, infinite and eternal, there's no one for him to love but himself. When I first heard that, it was so, I still get chills. It's so powerful. And then, he explains his whole cosmology, everything, just like, he takes the perspective. And yeah, Buddhism, I was really very excited to study Tai Chi and study under Thich Nhat Hanh certain elements of Buddhism. But Baba, it's not self-help. It's like it takes a perspective and blows it like so out of the water. Like Buddhism, the scale is like, well, what would you think about such and such happening 300 years from now? Well, Baba is like, don't even worry about it. This is such a dream. Don't even think about time. Time is a dream. Forget it. Everything's a dream. Oh, God, don't even start. So I'm walking in, and my imagery is like walking into a lake. I just feel like it's just like the water's rising around me. It's not waves, it's not resistance, it's not anything fancy, no big sudden like whatever. It's just like this wave. And one of those days it just sort of pops over my head, and I'm like, just have to go to the center. And we didn't even go until, I think, after we were married. So that was in 97, I think. We'd been dating and finally got married. I think we married in 97, but we went to Arizona for our honeymoon. Now I think about it, like, that's weird. Like, why wouldn't you go to the center for your honeymoon? So then later that year, finally, my first time at the center, I had been going to Bao meetings and Darwin Shaw I got to meet a few times. So I was definitely hooked. but going to the center, hearing people's stories, just sitting around the kitchen and just being like, wow, yeah, people's stories, you know, they really sell you. It's pretty phenomenal. So on the flight back, I was like, I'm a Bob lover. It just happened. It was just like so easy. Baba just, you know, he didn't give me a lot of like turbulence or anything. It was just like, it just sort of like water level rose and over my head. Now I'm sunk, hook, line, and sinker, and I'm all in. So one of the things that did happen relatively soon after is I got involved with Meher Baba House. I was president of Baba House for 3 years and organizing meetings and churning out newsletters and videotaping speakers. I was just so totally engaged. It was exciting times, but part of that busyness, I'll have to say, was probably hiding the fact that the marriage was not going so great. So I did eventually split up and moved out. But anyway, I was gonna then kind of tell the story in reverse because I didn't know for a good long time about some of these details. So one of the details is that where the house was, the marital home, was in Bronxville, which is right off the Bronxville Parkway. Baba was going up and down that in 52, going from the Scarsdale house, where he was recuperating from the accident, going down to the city, to Ivy Deuce's apartment and back out again. And so, you know, traveling up the Bronxville Parkway was absolutely nothing. And yet, look at that, you know, I'm pilgrimaging like as a normal course of everyday life. I mean, remarkable. I'm still like, dang, why didn't I know more, you know? So later on, we did find out through Kathy Riley where that house was, and we would visit every once in a while. It's just really amazing when you think that Baba spent, I think it was like 10 days or 14 days in that house. I remember it being a relatively long period of time, and I'd have to look it up now. The next take, I'll tell you more detail. So then the other interesting thing is that I was going to acupuncture school at the time. I was commuting down to the city and coming back out, and it was crazy busy. Going to school is very intense for anybody, but it was med school, you know, it was med school in its own way. And we had to memorize a lot. It was a lot of studying, a lot of just sort of like buried my head. And I just needed a little job, like a little part-time job to pay for commuters, rail ticket, you know, that sort of thing. And I remember going through this silly thing like, oh, I'll never find a job that's right and gonna fit my schedule, and you know, doing the whole like, me. And I get this little, it was advertised as a Guy Gal Friday, and you know, flexible hours, and someplace in sort of upper, I guess that's Upper West Side. It's 33 West 67, sort of north of Hell's Kitchen officially, I guess, something like that. Anyway, I can never remember exactly where Hell's Kitchen ends, but anyway, 33 West 67, and I go interview the job. It's just such a nice guy, and he's got this sort of loft office, and he's up at the top of the building, and he lives down at the bottom. This is, I guess, he worked it out with a building that he could rent some space above, and he did his thing up there. So what I ended up doing for him was somewhat miscellaneous. He had a company, and I would work in creating graphics for that company and organizing papers, and every time they had to put a proposal together, you know, I was collating stuff. And then after a while, I was actually doing his genealogy. He was paying his office workers company time to put together his family genealogy, and I was involved in the graphics for that and that sort of thing. It was this gigantic book. So because I was involved in that, he invited me to the little reunion that he had for the whole family, and so I got to see one of the apartments. So all of this is going to be relevant in a minute, but I got to see one of his apartments, and it was a clear story. You walk in, And then there's this gigantic living room, and the second floor has a sort of balcony that can look over that, so it's just this total like double layer first floor, in the living room anyway. So really spacious and gorgeous, and wow, this is New York City living at its best, right? So it's something like maybe even 10 years later. During that time, I read Billy Eaton's book, and she met Baba at Ivy Deuce's apartment. It's all really fascinating, all this stuff that happened in '52, and then Don Stevens met Baba at Ivy Deuce's apartment, and all this stuff. And then finally, I read Darwin Shaw's book, and it's a huge tome, so detailed, it's a wonderful read. And I'm going along, and it's like, wait a minute! 33 West 67, that's where Ivy Deuce's apartment was. All those stories, Billy Eaton, Darwin Shaw meeting Baba there, Don Stevens met Baba for the first time there. I mean, like, it blew my mind. So Don Stevens tells the story of how he meets Baba for the first time there, right? So he's in that sort of living room space, and Baba's up in the library, and he's sort of like in a holding area. And then finally gets to go meet Baba, and he comes down, and he's all like choked up, and he wanders around the city, and he comes back because he just can't stay away. He doesn't have an appointment. He's just like, I'll just sneak in, be very quiet. And he finds Baba talking in that sort of like open living room space, but he's facing the other way. He's got his leg in a cast, he's like, his leg is out, and he's just talking forward, and Don Stevens coming behind him. And Don Stevens is just like, he's so shocked and sort of like, he's still recovering. He's going like, how perfect, Bob. He wasn't even listening to what Bob was saying. He was just thinking, oh, how perfect this is all, like just. And Baba, through great effort, turns around, like shimmies around. And the second that Don Stevens goes like this, Baba's hands meet. And he's just like floored. Blown away. So then he's so flummoxed, and he's just thinking, he's a scientist type, so he's like thinking, what are the odds? And like, the second that I go like this, Baba, and the second time, Baba, like through great effort, again. And it happens a third time, and the third time now Don is like, oh my God, I just feel so guilty. I'm doing this to, and so like, after all that, trying to sneak in behind Baba and be quiet and not be present, not supposed to be there, and Baba knows very clearly he's sitting right there. He's so clear that like, we know you're there and we're gonna respond. It's like so amazing. Baba's amazing. So then they all wrap up. Baba's going somewhere, and he gets into this tiny Civil War wheelchair. I mean, it's really, really narrow, and they wheel him down the hallway, and it's just like, I just realized all these apartments must be pretty similar. I mean, the floors, I don't know that there's more than one apartment per, well, and they're 2 stories, right? So Ivy Deuce was the 3rd floor, so it must have been pretty similar to the apartment I was in. And this is now 10 years later. I'm like, God, why didn't I look more carefully at everything? Dang it. But what is nice is that Baba gets into this wheelchair, gets wheeled down, they wait for the elevator. I've been in that elevator. I've been in that elevator like 100 times. And I was just like, oh, I was so floored. I just couldn't believe that Baba found me. Like, when I think of my whole story and all the travel I did, and how did I end up in New York after everything that I've done in my life. My parents dragged me out to Kenya. We traveled to China. Like, I could have ended up anywhere, and Baba plucked me and put me in New York and put me in a place where I was doing pilgrimage every single day, and I didn't know it. And I look at these trail of breadcrumbs, and just, I'm just so touched. Like, why me? Like, how silly is this that he wants me? Like, who am I? And what is this about? And gosh, like, how do you even doubt that he wanted you? Because, like, look at that. Like, I'm going up and down this elevator. So just to describe it, because not everyone's going to have the chance to go into this residential building. You walk in, and it's this nice old building with, just gorgeous, sort of like marble floors, that sort of polished marble kind of look, the chipped marbles and stuff like that. And you walk in, there's a staircase, but to the left there's this elevator that has that chain gate, and there's a guy. When I was going up and down this elevator, there was still a guy who had to operate the thing. It's one of those old elevators. So back in Baba's time, there must have been a doorman. Who's the doorman, Like, who was that? Who was lucky enough to be bringing Baba up and down that little elevator? It was a tiny elevator that probably took like 4 people, 5 people max. So like if someone was waiting to go up or down, they would just, yeah, that's okay. We'll pass. It was tiny. And, little lever that goes up and goes down, and you had to ring it, and if it missed you, anyway, there was a person going up and down, so it wouldn't necessarily miss you, but there would be times that you had to wait for the next ride because it was tiny. So yeah, I can see why they used the tiniest little Civil War wheelchair, because it wouldn't have fit otherwise. Especially with Baba's entire party coming down right afterwards, it would have been going up and down a lot of times for all the people. Yeah, so that's basically my story, and of course we've finally ended up in Myrtle Beach, and the story continues, but I have to say it's just been wonderful to be in Myrtle Beach. Being a Baba lover in New York was exciting at the time, but people are retiring, they're moving south, and it's not happening in New York. It's happening in the South right now. Everything Baba related is happening further south. Used to be. New York was such a crazy thoroughfare. Just about every important Baba lover of our previous generation came through New York, lived in New York, was in New York, had time in New York, had an apartment in New York, whatever, like some relationship. And now it's all Myrtle Beach and, shall we say, Asheville? Sorry, but that's the truth, right? Yeah. So, Jai Baba, hope you enjoyed that story.